Well, the turmoil within federal government ranks over vaccine mandates just highlights the influence that right-wing political parties could exercise at the coming election. The Prime Minister, who said it's time for governments to get out of people's lives, has been accused of pandering to extremists in a bid to stop Conservative voters switching to the likes of One Nation, which is targeting rising anger over vaccines and lockdowns. Clive Palmer's United Australia Party is also seeking to capitalise on the so-called freedom movement to leverage support at the election. The United Australia Party will run candidates in all 151 lower house seats on the Trump-esque sounding slogan, Make Australia Great Again. Clive Palmer, welcome back to Breakfast.
We're not running on the slogan, Make Australia Great Again, Fran. We're running on the slogan, Save Our Country.
Save our country. OK, I've stand corrected. Clive Palmer, at the last election, you spent big to the tune of $80 million to help sink Bill Shorten and Labor. You got nobody elected for the UAP yourself. Who are you targeting this time around? Is it Liberal and National parties just as much as Labor and the Greens?
I think we're responding to the needs of the Australian people for political leadership. There's over 500,000 people marched in Melbourne last weekend, 150,000 people marched with Craig Kelly in Sydney, and 45,000 people were with me at the Botanical Gardens a week before. So there's a large volume of Australians that are dissatisfied with the current status quo, both in the media and in Parliament, and they want an alternative, and they also want freedom of choice in whatever they do.
Well, you say you're standing for a large volume of Australian people. I mean, the larger, by a long shot, of Australian people are vaccinated. You want the next election to be a referendum on vaccine mandates and freedom. More than 86% of the population over 16 are now fully vaccinated. The single dose is 91.8%. So nearly 92% Australians have spoken they want to be vaccinated. So you're representing a noisy minority. Is that right?
No, that's absolutely wrong, of course. We don't believe...
Why is that wrong?
Well, if you'll give me the same time that you've had to make your point, I can tell you. And that is because people should have the right to choose whether they get vaccinated or not. Many of our party members have been doubly vaccinated. They're not anti-vaxxers per se. I've been vaccinated with most vaccines except this one because it hasn't gone through any testing. We don't know what the second 2-year, 3-year or 5-year safety effects will be with this vaccine. So I believe in Australia's vaccine standards, which have been established over nearly 40 years.
Yeah, but this has been passed through our standard regulator, the TGA.
Yeah, well, the standard regulator, TGA, has done no domestic tests in Australia at all, but just adopted data from the United States based on 1 year's testing. Now, the standard procedure in Australia for a new vaccine is a 10-year development cycle, not a 1-year development cycle. Now, people are entitled to have different points of view, Fran, and nothing's more personal than a person's own body. If they decide they don't want to inject it, or they decide they do want to inject it, that's what we call freedom of choice. The Nuremberg...
Yeah, and that's the law in our country. I mean, no one's forced to get a vaccine in this country.
Well, that's certainly not true. I mean, there's coercion being used all the time. If you're a father supporting 5 children, your job's taken away you by the government interfering, by Scott Morrison taking inaction, if you're losing your livelihood, if these sort of coercions going on against you, some people have got no choice. And that's what's happening here. The government is using threats to industry. For example, advertisements that we want to place on the media. Media owners have been told if they take them, the government will cancel their advertising contract. And most newspapers around the country are fairly struggling anyway, so they can't afford to use government advertising.
But Clive Palmer, choice cuts both ways. Senator Jackie Lambie in the Parliament this week said that without vaccine mandates, you're playing Russian roulette with people's lives. I mean, vaccinated people, many vaccinated people want to be kept safe. That's what the mandates are all about. That's, they want the choice to go to work in a safe environment. That's the choice too, isn't it?
That's misinformation.
What do you mean misinformation?
Well, if you let me explain, if you go to Gibraltar, for example, the most vaccinated country in the world with 118% vaccination, it's 118% because the Spanish wilk has come across the border. They have the highest amounts of COVID cases in the world at the moment per capita of persons. And it's well known that if you're vaccinated, you can catch the virus and you can pass it on. It makes no difference at all from a public health context.
Well, it does make a difference in a public health context because it makes a difference to how sick people get and the load on the intensive care units in our hospitals and the number of people who die from it. It does make that difference.
Well, there's no data to support that in Australia.
Yes, there is. We've got the data on the number of people who are dying who are vaccinated as against unvaccinated.
No, many people take the view that they may die in 2 or 3 years' time, because side effects are not just when you take the vaccines.
Yeah, but you can't say there's no data. I mean, we have got the data on the number of people in intensive care and the number of people who are dying.
Well, I can say so. If you have a look at your own report in Adelaide, you'll see an intensive nurse came out and said that 30% of people in IV were doubly vaccinated, and that was being suppressed by the media. Now, these are different points of view, and people are entitled in democracy to have different points of view, and we believe in freedom of choice. We're portrayed in the media, and indeed you have this morning, that we're against vaccination. We're a pro-choice party, and saying that that you have got the right to decide what happens to your own medical treatment. But we're not standing just on that. We're standing on a whole lot of other platforms, such as that we don't believe there should be lockdowns. We don't believe that that the legislation that's happening in the States is in line with the democracy we've known in Australia, and many Australians agree with that. And when Jim Cairns went to in the 60s to the streets with his moratorium movement, he had about 100,000 protesters. We saw in Melbourne there was 500,000 protesters.
Okay.
But the ABC didn't cover it. You guys didn't cover it to the extent of what was happening.
Well, look, let's get back to you're running for Parliament. Let's get back to what you are demanding and you want. I mean, you say that Scott Morrison has abandoned Australia. What would the Prime Minister have to do or say when it comes to the issue of vaccine mandates and vaccine passports and future lockdowns for you and your money to back off in the lead up to the election? Or do you want Scott Morrison gone? Is that what you're trying to achieve?
No, our parliamentary leader, Craig Kelly, tabled 2 bills in Parliament that he drew up over 4 weeks ago. One of them was to ban vaccine passports. And, of course, the Prime Minister came out just recently criticising the Queensland Premier that she shouldn't have vaccine passports, yet he caused the Liberal Party to vote against Mr Kelly's bill. So he's not being genuinely telling the truth to the Australian people. He's represented to people before the last election that he was against a net zero outcome, and he changed his position and adopted net zero outcome. So he says one thing one day and does another thing. So what we want from a Prime Minister or a Member of Parliament is honesty. It doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with what he says, but he's at least got to be honest to the Australian people and not be Scotty from marketing, just trying to get votes.
Can you? I want to ask you about the tone of the protests. You addressed the Brisbane rally on the weekend, where there were cries of "Hang the bitch," a reference to the female Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk. In Melbourne, there have been death threats against the Premier Daniel Andrews. Gallows and nooses have been paraded through the streets. Do you condemn this violent language and imagery?
Yeah, I think we condemn anyone that says that there should be violence or this sort of thing. But certainly, people should have the right to express their point of view. And
hang on. Is that a qualifier? I mean, you stood on that stage. If you're on that stage and you're seeing that, why don't you call that out and condemn it on the stage? I mean, are you trying to walk both sides of the street here?
Well, no, I didn't see it on the stage. I didn't see that, what you're talking about. I think that happened during a march. That's what the ABC report said. I can only go on the ABC reporter that was there. It certainly didn't happen in front of me on the stage, friend. And unfortunately, you weren't there. And
if it had, would you have condemned it? Would that be your role?
Well, certainly it's wrong. It's certainly wrong to threaten anyone with violence, but, the large majority of people, over 500,000 people, which is a lot of people in Melbourne, were peaceful. And they wanted to make their point of view that they didn't want to be vaccinated. Now, that's their legitimate right in a democracy. We see this morning that Mark McGowan saying that if you're not vaccinated, you can't come to Parliament. And he's limiting who goes into the Parliament. Now, the assumption is that if you're not vaccinated, you've got the virus, which is just not true. Unvaccinated people are not ill. Unvaccinated person for meningitis doesn't mean he's got meningitis, yet they're being discriminated against. Elected representatives are not being allowed to take their position in Parliament. And history tells us that's a very bad tactic when people are excluded from the democratic process.
So what would your policy be for, and I know there's unvaccinated, I think Craig Kelly's unvaccinated, and certainly Senator Rennick said he is, that people get tested before they come into Parliament. Is that how you'd see it working?
Well, I think the reality of it is that there's a lot of infectious diseases that are just as bad as COVID. If you look at the number of deaths in Australia, it's less than the number of deaths on the roads or in influenza. But it certainly destroyed the Australian economy. and we don't get tested for every. We don't get tested.
So
for
you're not
every-
suggesting people have to be tested before they go to Parliament?
I think if people do have an infectious disease, that's a good reason for not having them in Parliament. But it's wrong to assume the entire community should be persecuted because there's a fear of it. Because
Okay.
if you live your life on fear, you may as well stay in your bedroom and not do anything.
Speaking of Parliament, as I said, you spent more than $80 million last election. You got nobody elected. You're currently, I understand, sifting through more than 1,500 nominations for all 151 lower house seat candidates. You're also going to be running Senate tickets in states and territories. Are you going to run yourself?
Well, I haven't decided on that. I think Craig Kelly's our leader. I'm certainly happy to follow him and to do all I can to help. I'm 67 years of age now. I'm retired. I only came out of this retirement to help and assist Mr. Kelly in what he wants to do. And certainly he's a courageous leader. And whatever you say, he's presenting a different point of view to the Australian public. And that's
Can I just nail that down there? Are you ruling yourself out as a Senate candidate or a lower house candidate?
I haven't considered it. We have at the moment.
Have you ruled it out?
No, but we've gone through the candidates at the moment. We've got some excellent candidates, and they've got to be evaluated. And the executive of the party, not me, is going to make the decision. Can I just correct one thing?
Yeah.
We did achieve our objectives at the last election very, very successfully. You know, I requested before the election that our voters vote for the coalition, and most of them did. And that got Scott Morrison back, as the ABC recognises.
Yes.
And, of course, you imagine if Bill Shorten had spent that $1 trillion before COVID had come, it would have been a disaster for this country.
All right. What's your end game this time? Will you preference the coalition again this election? Will you direct your supporters to preference the coalition again and put Labor last again?
Frame, we've already made an announcement with the Liberal Democrats that we'll be preferencing them, and for sure Liberal, Labor and Greens will be at the bottom of our ticket. They're all the same. They've all got the same policy, and Australians should vote for us.
Clive Palmer, thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Bye.
Clive Palmer is chair of the United Australia Party.